Oh, hey everyone, welcome back. I say welcome back because I've been chatting with you guys in the comments section for previous videos involving both of these TVs, and I knew this was going to be a popular comparison, but what? You guys are stoked to see the LG C9 battle up against the Samsung Q90. Here we go. Now, before I get going, I just want to say, look, I hear you. A lot of you in the comments are saying you want me to just get to the picture quality, and I get it. That's the most exciting part, but it's not necessarily the most meaningful part. There's a lot that goes into living with a TV, how you experience it, from how you set it up to how it sounds to how it is to operate. I think that's important stuff. So I'm going to cover that stuff, all right? But I will get to the picture quality. I promise. Just hang with me here. So let's start with the Samsung Q90R and specifically with the Samsung One Connect box. If you're familiar with Samsung TVs from the last couple of years, you know QLEDs come with the One Connect box, and this allows you to plug your game console, cable box, whatever, into this box, and then everything runs up to the TV through this One Connect cable. And folks, the installation ease that this affords is huge. You know, when you don't have to punch holes in the wall and run power, it just makes mounting the TV that much easier. That's a big deal. And speaking of mounting the TV, if you're gonna mount this TV, go ahead, splurge, get the Samsung No Gap wall mount. Makes a huge difference with how this TV looks up on the wall. Look, it's not thin, right? Not like an OLED. It's got full array locally dimmed backlights, and that takes some space. But when you get it right up against the wall like that, it looks fantastic. You're never gonna know that it's thicker than an OLED unless you go and hang out and look at the side of the TV, and you got better things to do. Just watch the TV. Now, if you're not gonna wall mount the TV, good news is Samsung got their stand game in order this year. You might remember prior years had these tubular stands that took up a lot of space. This one is much better. Very stable. There's a lot of ballast here. In fact, it's responsible for the lion's share of the weight in the box. It's almost as heavy as the TV, but that helps make it super stable. And look, we've got some really good vertical clearance here. Just enough space to fit a Samsung soundbar. What a coincidence. But I really do like this smaller footprint. I think it makes it a lot more realistic for folks who don't have a huge media stand. Other than that, aesthetically speaking, the bezel is nice and trim. It's a very attractive TV, one of the finest that you're gonna find out there. There's nothing more to say about that other than it just looks like a really, really high-end TV. Now we move on to the LG C9 OLED, which is a little bit more traditional in the way you connect to it. All of the HDMI ports are in the TV. More on the HDMI 2.1 spec in a second. Otherwise, almost no bezel, almost impossibly thin. And then as we come down to the bottom, we see that it has a similar stand to last year, although it's a little bit lower profile. It's still fairly wide. Your speakers aim down the bottom and then get radiated out through this scoop. And it turns out that the sound quality is much better than the Samsung. The LG has much more low-end punch and has a bigger, fuller sound all around. So it's a good thing that it sounds great because putting a soundbar in front of this is not gonna be easy. It is extremely low slung, which looks amazing, but makes it hard to put a soundbar in front of it. You're gonna wanna wall mount this TV and put a soundbar underneath it as opposed to put it in front of it on a stand like this because most soundbars are going to cover up a little bit of the lower part of the screen. So to wrap it up, you get a much smaller footprint with the stand here. You get the advantage of the One Connect box. It has fairly trim bezels. It's not too thick, and it can be flush mounted to the wall. Whereas with the LG, you've got a bigger footprint here. You conventionally connect to it right into the TV, almost no bezel and impossibly thin, although it's still gonna jut out from the wall just a little bit. Next, let's take a second to nerd out on some tech stuff real quick. I think there's some confusion around HDMI 2.1, what it brings, what the advantages will be, when we'll get to use those, and whether it's important if it actually has HDMI 2.1. Let's jump right into it. The LG C9 does have full spec HDMI 2.1 for all of its ports, which means you can take advantage of everything HDMI 2.1 will ultimately offer, which includes things like eARC and variable refresh rate, auto low latency mode, and a whole lot more. We actually have a great article on what HDMI 2.1 brings to the table at digitaltrends.com. Technically speaking, the Samsung does not have HDMI 2.1 licensing, but that's not really their fault. This whole licensing process takes a while, and Samsung wasn't able to complete it, I don't think, before they released their TVs. What's important for you to know is that the Samsung will support all the meaningful stuff that HDMI 2.1 brings. So Just think of it as sporting HDMI 2.1 features, okay, with variable refresh rate. And the difference with the Samsung there is that it does support FreeSync. Okay, so if you want to use FreeSync from your PC, you can do it with the Samsung Q90. You cannot with the LG. EARC, when it comes around, it'll be available. But really, we're talking about future-proofing features anyway. This is stuff that you'll take advantage of next year and the year after that when we see the new gaming consoles and new PCs coming out with higher-end GPUs with HDMI 2.1. Let's talk user interface for a second. Samsung's Tizen is great. Find the apps that you want, add them to your home ribbon down below, and you can easily access everything right down at the very bottom. It pops up things that you've recently watched. You can also switch your profile from right here, which is also convenient. It does take up a good amount of the screen though, very much different with the LG. Right away when I pop up WebOS on the LG TV, you can see it uses a little bit less space, it's lower slung, and even when it pops up stuff that you've watched before or makes suggestions, it's taking up a little bit less of the TV. It's also just a little bit snappier to use. Moving these apps is a little bit easier as well. For instance, I can just press and hold here. I can move it wherever I want, or I can use Intelligent Edit up here, which is a feature that figures out what apps I use the most and orders them that way. I think that's pretty handy. Let me ask you something really quick. Do you care about voice search and voice control? Do you use that feature? I really want to know. Leave a comment down below because I'm not sure how many people are actually using this stuff. But in case it is important to you, know this. LG uses a combination of its own AI and Google Assistant built into the TV so that when you press this mic button, you're getting some really good search help and voice control results. You can also use Google Assistant and Amazon Alexa to control the TV if you have one of those smart speakers. By contrast, the Samsung's built-in voice control is basically the Bixby system, and I don't mean to be too harsh here, but it's completely worthless to me. It doesn't understand what I'm saying half the time, and it's not very powerful. It doesn't have a very good search engine in my experience. So if that stuff is important to you, built into the TV, the LG is the clear winner there. Okay, finally, we're getting into picture quality. Before we do, let me just put this out there. You can't judge what you're seeing on these TVs, especially a comparison between the two, through what you're seeing on your screen. The fact of the matter is we're not shooting in HDR, and even if we were and going through the workflow and all that stuff, you probably wouldn't be watching on an HDR screen, and even then, you still don't get the impression. You really have to be here. So please trust my narrative on this. I'm going to try and point everything out to you that I think is meaningful. We'll start with what we're seeing on the screen right now, and that is 4K footage in SDR. And what I notice with these TVs is that in the really bright areas, whether it's clouds or a waterfall like this, the Samsung really leaps out at you. It does have brighter, punchier whites, and it's supercharging those bright highlight details. On the LG C9 OLED, it's not as bright and punchy at first, but what you notice is there's a bit more detail in those bright specular highlights. They're not super juiced up like they are in the Samsung. And overall, I'm getting a better balance of detail and better shadow detail in 4K SDR off of the LG right now. That isn't to say that this is not a great TV. It really does dazzle you, and it's going to really pop in the brightest of rooms, but it is super juicing what I see in the super bright whites, and that's just in the SDR tone curve. Whoa, hey, what's going on? He's wearing a hoodie and he has shorter hair. Well, what's going on is that we goofed a little bit, kind of. So if you saw the previous version of this video, and about 22,000 of you did, at this point in the video, we compared the two TVs, and we were looking at a scene of Bosch, and we were comparing just the standard HDR performance of each one. Here's the problem though. In the process of queuing these TVs up so that they're synced and we're showing you the same picture on the same one at the same time, we have to scrub through this timeline to get to just the right spot. It's actually very tricky. And when you do that, the TV hasn't had a chance to spool up to full 4K. It will in a matter of seconds, but it just hasn't yet. So when we had this freeze frame going, we had the Samsung in 4K HDR, and we had the LG at 1080p HDR. Now, as soon as we press the play button, instantly it goes into 4K mode. Now, it's a common myth that you don't get HDR lower than 4K. That's not true. You can get HDR at 720p. It maps a little bit differently as you go up in resolution, but most of the specular highlights, they look about the same. So if I press play on this, it starts out in HD, and then eventually it's gonna spool up to Ultra HD. See? It took a matter of seconds. And so when we did our evaluation, what we found was that the Samsung was actually blowing out less of the specular highlights. You could see more of the detail in this office light, for instance, than the LG was. And actually, we based our impressions on that based on several viewing sessions long before we shot that video. That was just to sort of set an example. And honestly, you can't see the difference through your computer screen or your TV screen or your phone screen, right? But indeed, when the LG spools up to full 4K, the effect is the same. It blows things out just a little bit more than it does on the Samsung, which is counter to what we saw in SDR and also to what you'll see with Dolby Vision in just a second. Anyway, I just wanted to clarify what happened there, full transparency. I'll be talking to you guys in the comments about what happened there, but it changes nothing about the assessment. It's just that we made a goof on when we paused the TV. The other thing I'm noticing, this paints a very clear picture of what the color temperature difference is like on an LG OLED. It is always tended a little bit towards a green tint. You can calibrate some of that out, but again, I think most of you are going to pull this out of the box, pick the best looking setting that you like, and that's what you're going to get. Now, when you watch the TV, you don't notice that it has a green hue. You only get that if you make a comparison. Here we have a much more natural look at the room. It has a more typical white with a less green tinge to the paint. So different, but both very good. And I'm very curious about why we're seeing some blown out highlights there. One of the advantages of the C9 is that it will hold peak brightness for a little bit longer than prior OLEDs had. So there's a possibility that if we left this image static long enough, it would calm down, but that doesn't apply to real world viewing. So now let's take a look at what the difference between HDR and Dolby Vision looks like on these TVs when running the same content. Okay, now I have a segment from Our Planet off of Netflix in HDR on the Samsung and in Dolby Vision on the LG. And I'm actually not noticing as distinct a difference as I was expecting. This appears a little bit more intense to me off axis, but when I'm right in front of the TVs, the HDR highlights are very, very similar. A little bit more sparkle out of the snow here on the LG than on the Samsung, but only moderately so. And I'm still seeing all of the detailed sparkle in the snow that's coming down on both televisions. In the color of the snow, a little bit of a green tinge here as opposed to over on the Samsung, but again, not as distinct a difference between the two as I was expecting in terms of how they handle HDR specular highlights. Both of them like to drive them a little bit and give you a lot of pop and wow. It just depends on whether you're watching an SDR or HDR or Dolby Vision, I suppose, the intensity of those HDR highlights. Both TVs though, handling them really, really well. One other aspect I want to cover here is motion. I think that the Samsung is looking a little bit more fluid and more clean than the LG C9 OLED in this particular test. That is without any motion smoothing turned on. If you engage some of the motion smoothing in the LG, you can eliminate a lot of that stutter, that kind of bright stutter that you get during panning scenes without necessarily bringing in soap opera effect. I just don't like that stuff. If I'm comparing them apples to apples with the motion smoothing turned off, the Samsung's performing a little bit better than the LG here. Finally, it wouldn't be an OLED versus QLED comparison if I didn't dig into the differences between the OLED panel and an LED LCD panel. You guys have heard me complain nonstop about halos around bright objects on a black background, about backlight bleed. I gotta say, the Q90 is doing a better job of controlling those problems than I've ever seen in the past, even as recently as 2 years ago with some of their premium QLED televisions. There's very little halo going on here at all. In fact, we've overexposed the camera a little bit just to show you that it is there a little bit, but it is definitely not distracting. And if you're watching with even a little bit of ambient light in the room, you're just not gonna notice it. The backlight is less of an issue than it used to be before. And I'm impressed. I think off-angle viewing is a lot better with this TV than in the past. Certainly reaches a broader audience without washing out quite so much. This is a real improvement to the technology that just seems to get better year after year. All right, so which one's the best? Well, honestly, that's gonna kind of depend on you. If you're a picture purist, then I gotta go with the LG C9 OLED. I prefer the look of an OLED picture. It's just deeper and the highlights are fantastic. The color is fantastic. Also, if you're not gonna use a soundbar or a surround sound system, LG wins there as well. It's a much better sounding TV, although that's less important to people these days. Also, I prefer the interface just a little bit on the LG, especially if you're gonna use voice control at all, definitely the LG. But if you're a hardcore gamer, If you're worried about burn-in, and I don't think most of you should be, but if you're a hardcore gamer, know that while the LG does support variable refresh rate, it does not support FreeSync. That's something that you're only going to get in the Samsung. So if you fancy the idea of getting yourself a hot rod gaming computer in the near future that supports variable refresh rate through HDMI 2.1, Samsung would be the way to go there. And again, burn-in, I don't think it's a huge problem for everybody, but it does happen. So if you watch a lot of the same station for a long time, if you play a lot of the same game with the same graphics static on the screen, then you might feel a little bit more comfortable going with the Samsung. I will say this, the picture quality has never been closer than it is now. I mean, the Samsung is doing a jam-up job. It does have slightly brighter highlights. It's a little overdriven there, so you might lose a little bit of detail in the brightest of the highlights, but hey, black levels have never looked better on an LED TV than they do right now with this Samsung Q90, and shadow detail has improved a lot, off-axis viewing has improved a lot. It's an astounding TV, and that One Connect box, that might be the thing that seals the deal for a lot of people because it's just so easy to get this TV set up and running. So again, you're gonna be happy with either one of these TVs. It really comes down to what your specific needs are, and I think that we've hopefully done a pretty good job of painting, what kind of user each TV is good for. Hey guys, thanks for watching. It means a lot to us. Hey, I got a haircut in the middle of this shoot for you. Leave your comments down below. That's the most valuable thing ever. We want to know what you think. Hit like, hit subscribe, hit that notification bell. And while you're here, check out 2 videos we think you might like. As always, visit digitaltrends.com for the latest tech news and reviews.